Hello, you're listening to CorpusCast, the show all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. I'm your host, Robbie Love, and I'm a lecturer in English language at Aston University. Happy New Year! It's our first episode of 2023, and it's our first birthday. We started in January last year, so thank you to everyone, and of course, every single guest who has made our first year of CorpusCast so much fun. And of course, thank you to everybody who's been listening and watching to the show. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Dawn Knight and Dr. Anne O'Keefe about corpus linguistics and online communication, particularly in these virtual settings that we are often in the workplace. We're more connected than ever before, but are we communicating effectively? Amid COVID-19 and the so-called digital pivot, online virtual communication has been placed at the heart of our daily lives, both professionally and privately. As we move into the post-COVID context, the affordances of this digital turn have shown that we can operate professionally online. But there is a need for a better understanding of what has become and is likely to remain a new way of communicating in the workplace. Now, these aren't my words, but the words of today's guests who are leading a research project using methods, including corpus linguistics, to better understand virtual communication in the workplace. Dr. Dawn Knight is Reader in Applied Linguistics at Cardiff University. Her research interests lie in the areas of corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, and multimodality. She has expertise in developing methodological frameworks for corpus compilation and in developing methodological approaches to the construction of minoritized language corpora. Recently, she was a principal investigator on the National Corpus of Contemporary Welsh, leading on the creation of a large-scale open source corpus of contemporary Welsh language. And she's also a former chair of the British Association for Applied Linguistics. My other guest today, Dr. Anne O'Keefe, is Senior Lecturer in Applied Linguistics at Mary Immaculate College, where she specializes in the use of corpus linguistics to explore areas such as pragmatics, discourse analysis, learner grammar, and media discourse. She is the editor of the Routledge Applied Corpus Linguistics series and the Routledge Corpus Linguistics Guide series, as well as co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Corpus Linguistics. She's also director of the Intervarietal Applied Corpus Studies, IVACS, Research Center, an international network of corpus researchers working in applied linguistics. Basically, both Dawn and Anne are wonderful, successful, and fantastic people in the corpus linguistics community, and it's a great pleasure to have them both on the show. So please welcome Dawn Knight and Anne O'Keefe to CorpusCast. Hello, both.
Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Robbie.
Hi, welcome. Thank you both for agreeing to come on. It's great to see you both, and I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to you about your work. And I hope that you enjoyed that a rather lengthy introduction, but deservedly so, because you're both such busy people who've got so much going on. So thanks again for coming on. I want to start by asking you both a couple of questions that I ask every guest here on CorpusCast. And Anne, we'll start with you. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Okay, thanks for the really kind introduction as well, Robbie. For me, corpus linguistics is a really exciting way of looking at language patterns, but doing so on a large scale and doing so empirically. So in one sense, it gives you corpus tools to do a lot of the work. The computer's going to do the counting, it's going to do the retrieving. But I suppose for me, the most exciting part of corpus linguistics is actually what happens next when you have frequency results. Where do you go? And that's the kind of sweet spot really of observation and interpretation, where you have to form hypotheses, you have to compare, you have to go back to the data, you have to go back down deep into the text, you have to compare again, you have to hone the observation and the hypothesis and so on. So really it gives us this great opportunity to understand patterns of meaning in real language use. And the computer helps us do that on a large scale, but the computer doesn't do it for us. It helps us.
And how did you get started in this world of corpus linguistics? Has it been part of your academic life since the beginning, or is it something that caught your attention a little bit later on?
Well, I'd say nobody starts out saying, I'm going to become a corpus linguist. There's always some moment that brings them there. And very often, especially in my generation of corpus linguists, when I say that, I mean like the start of the millennium, where I was undertaking a PhD. For people who started around that time, there's usually a person who brought you into corpus linguistics. And for me, and for many other people, that was Michael McCarthy. He was external examiner at Limerick at a time when I was looking for a topic for my PhD. He was talking about the CAN Code project, and it sounded so exciting. And through Mike, then I got to know people in Nottingham, and I guess the rest is history, really. That's how I got into corpus linguistics. And the lucky thing for me is that Mike McCarthy, Ron Carter, they got into corpus linguistics because they happened to be hired by John Sinclair at Birmingham. So it's a wonderful connection, and I got to meet John Sinclair, and I feel hugely honoured for that.
And Dawn, let me ask you the same question. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Thanks, Robbie. Just to say happy birthday to CorpusCast and Happy New Year as well.
Oh, thank you very much.
So it's generally the same sort of thing about answer as Anne's given. It's mainly about answering interesting questions about what we say and do and kind of how we do it, but at scale. So Anne mentioned computers. They kind of are the kind of crux of what we use, but they don't give all the answers to everything. But we use computational tools and computers to provide interesting ways to inquire about language use. So it offers a sort of principled and evidence-based insight into communication within and across different contexts. And
thank you. Yes. I think there are definitely themes that I've noticed across the last year. But interestingly, some people do lean more towards the talking about the quantitative side, and others lean more towards the really, it's a means to an end, but it's still, language at the heart of it, and trying to understand language use. Dawn, again, same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your academic journey as well.
Okay, for me, it was all about timing. I was in the right place at the right time, really. Connection with the University of Nottingham as well. So I was doing my master's in the mid-noughties, and there was a lot of activity in corpus linguistics going on there with people like Ronald Carter, Mike McCarthy, and Svenja Adolphs as well. And they started to have a major influence on the field, particularly in spoken corpus linguistics. And they were very much connected to the department. So there was a kind of a lot of activity, as I say, in that area. So I first encountered it on an MA programme. Svenja was teaching a module on corpus linguistics, and I remember all the students going into the module having absolutely no idea what it meant or what we were supposed to be doing. And there was a very early misconception that it was all about maths, all about stats. But to me, it was something that was beyond that, something that was very new, very exciting, and I could quite quickly understood the potential for it, I guess. Obviously, with a great teacher, that was very helpful. But I did have experience with maths and further maths when I was at school, I guess. So that did help a little bit, but I could see beyond the numerical aspect. So from that, Svenja encouraged me to do a PhD. So I got an ESRC scholarship. Originally, I was planning to look at the sociolinguistic representation of aging using corpus methods. And so I started doing that. And within about a year, I was involved or somehow got involved on various research projects, including one that Anne was involved in. She might mention it in a minute. And Svenja and Ron were starting to work in and develop sort of approaches to multimodal corpus linguistics. So I ended up one foot in that, one foot in my PhD. So I thought, to make things a bit easier, kill two birds, one stone, to align them with each other. So it was very lucky. So my kind of shifted the focus of my PhD. I'm still interested in aging, but went down a very different path. And that sort of work and getting involved in those projects gave me a taste of interdisciplinary, can never say that word, interdisciplinary research, and working with people from computer science, IT, psychology, and gave me a really good taste of working collaboratively on large-scale projects and to see what corpus linguistics could offer beyond applied linguistics. So that kind of brought me to where I am today, but that was a long-winded answer.
Now we are going to touch for both of you how some of the research you've done between then and now is informing the work you're doing now. But I do want to kind of skip forward to the present day. You are both co-principal investigators on a very big project funded by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Irish Research Council, called Interactional Variation Online, Harnessing Emerging Technologies in the Digital Humanities to Analyze Online Discourse in Different Workplace Contexts. Let's start with the big picture. First of all, congratulations on getting the funding for this project. What sorts of interactions are you interested in this context?
Well, I guess the context is like this one, online meetings that we've become more and more used to. It's not that they didn't exist before COVID, but I guess there was very much a pivot, a necessary pivot. So we're looking at workplace discourse in this context across cultural organizations, business organizations, and public sector organizations as well, trying to cut across the different types. And on one level, we're trying to investigate the discourse itself, but as Don might explain, we're also trying to move more research into a multimodal space. So trying to provide enabling tools, because these type of data are easy to gather in a sense, because it's easy to record a meeting. But then how can we help people to move away from just doing a transcription of a spoken text? That's another one of the big aims of the project.
Yeah, I might pick up on that as well, if that's okay, Robbie. As you know from your own work, Robbie, that spoken corpus development is still pretty laborious. And there's been quite a few barriers to the construction of big and useful data sets. But as Anne has explained, the digital pivot has kind of changed the way that we might be able to do things. And so one of the things that we're offering as part of the project is developing sort of guidelines or guidelines for other researchers to come along and kind of replicate what we're doing. So how might they create a multimodal data set, and how might they approach the analysis of this? I say quick and dirty is the sort of way we're going to approach this, and some people don't like that expression, but that's kind of what it is, to make it as accessible to any type of researcher as possible. So a lot of work on the kind of methodological side of things there. It's kind of evolving standardized ways of doing it. When I first did my PhD and all that sort of research back in Nottingham over 10 years ago, we kind of outlined some of the challenges, technological, methodological, and practical challenges associated with this work. And some of them still exist today, but now we're in a position to be able to respond to them as well. So that's part of what we're doing as well.
So it's a case of trying to better integrate transcription, which is the sort of standard approach, as you said, to studying speech in a corpus context, with all of the other elements of this sort of interaction. Of course, it didn't really occur to me that this is quite meta, in that we are talking about the sort of interaction you're studying using the mode of interaction that you're studying. And so maybe later on, I'll be able to sort of read some of your findings and go, okay, maybe I should do that better in this way here. Yes, I suppose I'm sort of skipping around some of the topics here, but since we're talking about multimodality, I want to ask about that a little bit more. What is the sort of the state of the art in terms of the transcription? Is, as I said, a well, accepted part of studying spoken corpus data, but is the goal eventually to be able to essentially analyze the visual elements of spoken interaction in the same way that you would be able to search through the textual representations in corpus data?
To some extent, yes, and it kind of is already possible. So we learn quite a lot from psychology, gesture studies, and so on, and even quite a lot in computer science, and they create digital tools for tracking gesture and things automatically. We're not doing that. We're trying to say, as an analyst, an applied linguist, how would we approach these data sets? So it's kind of protocols for sharing as well as approaching the data. So you might share methods for annotating certain head nods, but looking at function as well as form. And it's yeah, and
yeah, I guess, Robbie, it's a really relevant question in that, I mean, you'd love to be able to put in a search for head nod and boom, all the head nods come up, but you know very well, somebody's got to actually annotate when that head nod happened as you head nod while I'm talking. So, you know, we're using tools like ELAN for precision here and tiering and so on. But the micro detail then that generates, that does require a lot of qualitative analysis, qualitative annotation. So, yeah, it is challenging, but we still think that it's really worth doing. But it does mean moving away from the notion of corpus linguistics being searching for a form, and let's use the form here to be, you know, nonverbal as well, and then generating a result and then seeing how it functions. I think we need to also think about the opposite direction, where you're looking at a function that's been described, you go to this kind of data, then you annotate for that function. For example, right now we're looking at back channeling. So you identify all the things that are behaving as back channels. Right now you're nodding. So that would be tagged then as a back channel. And Dawn might say, well, that's also back channel. So then once you pull out all of the back channeling, you then can look at what forms are used to perform that function. That it's very labor intensive. So this project isn't going to result in a massive corpus. It's going to result more in protocols that will help people to do this type of analysis, because we just feel for years the tools have been with us to do more multimodal research, but it's just so much easier to just look at a transcript and look at it, put in a search for a form and get its frequency. So yeah, there are a lot of challenges ahead, but we hope to give something to the field.
Yeah, for those who watch CorpusCast on YouTube, I've been told that I do an awful lot of nodding. So if anyone were to end up trying to analyze this, so it causes them a lot of pain, because they'd have to do a lot of qualitative coding of my nodding. But you're right; it's such a big part of the way that we're interacting in these virtual contexts. So I think it's brilliant to develop these sorts of protocols as you're doing. And I'll stay with you, because you've published a lot of research in pragmatics, in conversational context, that I sort of gather mostly in the past have been looking at face-to-face situations, for instance, in higher education, university seminars, things like that. The methodological parts aside, to do with what we're discussing here with capturing the data and different ways of how we're searching the data, from a kind of theoretical perspective, do the sorts of things that we've come to know and assume about how people interact face-to-face, to what extent does that apply in this virtual setting? Is it more or less kind of taking those theories and applying them in the same way, or are there features that the fact that you're not in the same room with somebody, what effect does that have potentially on the way that we reconsider how people communicate through speech?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, and I don't know the answer yet, but I'm certain things are definitely coming to us. First of all, it is a mediated and managed type of interaction, but we can say that about an interview on TV or radio interview, etc. It's more on record. It could be recorded, etc. I do think that aspects of politeness, positive and negative politeness, that there are shifts there. I think that there's greater need to minimize face threat. In terms of positive politeness, maybe the need for solidarity might be greater, and avoiding disagreement. I would say that's coming out in the work we're doing at the moment. Another area, probably more related to positive politeness and building solidarity, is that it's really difficult to do humor in this context. You can't really make a quick quip, because you disrupt the flow, because the technology then spotlights you. And I think that function of the technology, where it spotlights the speaker, also has an effect in terms of, you said it yourself, you would normally not nod as much, but you probably tend to nod because you know that even a minimal type of vocalization could bring unnecessary spotlighting to you when you just want to remain the listener and you don't want to grab the turn. So, the politeness side, we're noticing as well in terms of negative politeness that, greater mitigation. But on the other hand, the irony is that the power role holder in a hierarchical workplace situation probably has more power because they are chairing and they can hold the floor for longer. Even anecdotally, people say, I had an idea at that meeting, but I didn't want to interrupt, I left them talk, I think that we're noticing maybe greater mitigation on one level, but there are potentially access issues and equity issues there. And also, gaze is another one that's really difficult to work with, and even the alignment with traditional routines and phases of discourse, like what's an opening and what's a closing. Closings now, everybody's waving and that's the end. Where does a meeting start? The pre-meeting bit, etc. So I'm rambling on, but a lot of things are coming to us. A lot of things seem to be different. We're currently looking at back channel behavior, and that's proving really interesting because specifically we're noticing shifts.
Now, Dawn, we're talking quite broadly at the moment about what's sort of in the abstract. Are there any particular types of organizations that your project is interested in working with? Any sort of particular sectors? I suppose it's sort of through COVID, more or less every organization from every sector has had to switch to having at least some of these sorts of meetings. So are there any restrictions or particular contexts you're interested in?
It's a good question. Well, we put the initial proposal for this together during COVID. I remember those very long days, Anne, strapped to the computer getting this done. But we, from the sort of outset, we set to recruit and engage quite a large sort of cross-section of different type of stakeholders, really, or end users, including education, sort of cultural backgrounds, but also business domains. It was quite important to us to try to include a diverse set of sort of backgrounds or that sort of cross-section of domains within the design of the corpus to enable us to represent as many different contexts as possible. It's not exhaustive, as Anne said previously. We're not set to create a huge corpus here. It's more of a kind of case study approach, but we think these domains represent a good cross-section, and they allow us to get some quite good and representative sort of pictures about online communication. We've also got, well, I'll give you some specific sort of examples. We've got estate agents, theatre, publishing houses, City of Literature, a city council, communications company, and some representatives from the public sector as well. We've also gathered some data from political context, but it's a bit of an outlier. It works in a very different way, but some interesting questions have come up from that. So we might start to look at business discourse compared to political discourse and so on.
And presumably participation is quite easy for these organizations, because they just simply have to send you the recording of the meetings that they're having anyway, right?
Absolutely. We still encounter the sort of ethical challenges that I'm sure that you've encountered in the past, collecting spoken discourse, and the fact that people are seen, people are visible. In the past, when I've worked on previous projects, people have been quite opposed to kind of giving up the digital image because the visibility of things, but because of the shift in COVID, we're quite used to it. So it's just part of daily life. So yeah, they are more open to offering this sort of data to us, particularly now. Well, particularly as they understand that we're not trying to use it in a damaging way. It's just to help their own understanding. So the stakeholders on the project are all set to benefit in different ways. So for them, they get to understand how best to communicate in these contexts. How do they work in ways that allows everyone to engage with the conversation, to speak, and it's looking at the barriers, but also the carriers, what works well.
And I think it would be interesting to ask both of you this actually, because when you're working with these stakeholders who are not involved in academic research, typically linguistic research, corpus linguistics, even less so. When you come to sort of approach a potential stakeholder, a non-academic partner, as you have done with several organizations on this project, to what extent do you sort of try to explain the specifics of the methods? For instance, corpus linguistics. Do you sort of bother trying to sort of get them to kind of understand what you're doing with the data, or is it much more like, we're going to analyze it and we don't need to worry about the specific? Do you sort of try and explain exactly what you're doing, or do you feel that might sort of potentially put them off if they get too much detail of what you're going to do to the data? Maybe Anne, you want to start?
Yeah, I think we desperately try not to scare them off. The first fear is that you are interested in the content of what we're saying, that you're going to analyze in detail the content. And I think it really reassures people when you say, we're really interested in how you communicate more than what you say. And that's usually a big calmer. And I think we don't get too technical. And once we explain, what we're interested in terms of how meetings start and how the speaker changes and how it might, how they might deal with conflict or humor. I think everybody gets that. And I think Dawn had a lot of experience in this going outside of academia when she was involved in Cork, and that's really helped us as well. And I think you're right, just getting too technical doesn't necessarily help. It's more about reassurance that this is about looking at interaction and communication.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting word, reassurance, and something I've encountered in my work a couple of times is potential participants perhaps wondering if we're evaluating their language use. The fear that we're going to go away for a few months and come back and say, here's all the things that you're doing wrong, and that is that a sort of fear that you might have encountered with some of your participants as well?
I can come in on that, and actually I give some examples as well that Anne mentioned there. I don't think we've kind of encountered that really. It really is from the start, sort of thinking about stakeholders and their sort of engagement. It's really important when you're putting your research questions together and you're thinking about what specific interesting things are we trying to answer here. And method aside, it's about the problem. And being able to articulate the problem to anybody, so that includes the person who's reading the funding application, but that's the general public and those stakeholders, is the important thing. That's nothing about corpus linguistics necessarily. So that's the end bit, isn't it? So it's remembering our roots as applied linguists. So it's the application of the method rather than the corpus itself. So hopefully that answered your question. I completely forgot what the question was, but I'll talk a bit more about the example that Anne suggested there on cork ink. So with cork ink, it was slightly different because the end product was essentially the data set. From that, there's different ways, obviously, that people can use the data set. So in education for the lexicographers and the government and so on. But trying to articulate in the first place what a corpus was very tricky because it's very abstract. And it took us about 3 years of legwork to just demonstrating those applications again. So there's this thing that allows you to do these things. So it was very kind of, it was a steep learning curve, but a very important one. And now I've changed, if it was okay to keep waffling on, I've changed the approach slightly with another project that we're doing, an HRC funding project called Free Text, which is a free text analysis toolkit for English, but also Welsh. So it's a bilingual toolkit. And what we're using there is essentially some of the things that we built from cork ink, so part of speech taggers, semantic taggers, and so on for Welsh, but packaging them in a way that makes them useful and meaningful to anybody. So creating a sort of intuitive way of people kind of approaching a toolkit, but enabling them to analyze. So, when you've got survey data, there's always that question at the end where you can put your free text responses. People typically sit there, you might have a highlighter pen or try to do some content analysis. They're quite tricky to work with, aren't they? So we're creating a system where people can basically chuck in their text and get some sort of meaningful analysis. Those analyses are basically some of the corpus tools that we're used to, but we never mention that it's a corpus. We never mention that these are corpus techniques. We just make the process of interrogating the text meaningful and useful. So for that, it's all about education. So it's teaching people the benefits of corpus-based methods without even mentioning the word. So we don't have to badge it as that, even though it kind of is.
Yeah, the sort of distinction between how we as academics talk about our work and how we repackage that to the public audiences. You mentioned cork ink there, of course, this big national contemporary corpus of Welsh that you led on the development of, Dawn. Obviously, this is a different context now with the IVO project, but I suppose from jumping from leading one big into institutional multidisciplinary project to another one now, co-PI with Anne on this project. Is there anything sort of you said the lessons that you learned, from cork ink? What have you taken with you from that project into the IVO project now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the most important thing for any of these projects is relationships. So being able to work with others and being able to also to respect each other. It sounds really obvious, but you need to kind of find mutually achievable goals that everybody understands. And to understand also that when you're sat in a room with cork ink, there's a team of 30 people there from different sort of disciplines. So from education, from the software engineers, Welsh language experts, and so on, but also stakeholders. So again, people like the government, education providers, all sat in the same space. They have to be sat there for a reason, but also have space to talk and to all benefit in the same sort of way. So it's about respecting everybody's strengths and their abilities and drawing on them all to create something useful, I guess, but something that works. In cork ink, we had the dream team, and this is definitely dream team point 2. And Anne will possibly say why.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Anne, from your perspective, what does the process look like of putting together such a large, diverse group of researchers, for instance, from these various universities, the research team, advisory team, but then of course all the stakeholders and beneficiaries as well. What's the sort of time scale, from the germ of the idea to sending off your funding application? What are we talking weeks, months, years? I mean, can you share any sort of insight from how did that look from your perspective?
People ask us that question, and that was actually the easiest part. And the reason was because of the IVAX network that you mentioned at the beginning. Dawn approached me Dawn approached Svenja. Svenja, Dawn and I are already very connected through IVAX, and we have been for years. I thought, well, Fiona Farr here in Limerick, and that was an email. And then Sandrine Peraldi in UCD, who brought in a colleague, Ben Cowan, and Svenja had former PhD link with Swansea, and for me, my former PhD student based in Aberdeen. And honestly, it came together in a matter of days, but that's because there was just years of networked connections. We were immediately able to draw on that. And for a lot of projects, that's the difficult bit, trying to pick the people. But that really wasn't in our case. And I feel very fortunate for that. And I suppose it's a vindication of having all those years of networking engagements through the research centre.
Tell us a bit more about IVAX. I mentioned it at the beginning. Obviously, you lead this centre and network. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I hope the Vice President Research is not watching this, but like 20 years ago, he put out an email saying there's funding available for the establishment of research centres. And at that time, corpus linguistics in our institution, who'd heard of it? And I was the only person doing it. But I decided I'll create a research centre and I'll give it a name, and it'll allow me to formalise the connections that I have with Nottingham, with Belfast, with the other college within Limerick at the university. And so I just set it up out of a really strong need to have a tribe. And so that's how it grew. So through Mike, I had connections with Nottingham and Svenja and Ron. And then ultimately, within a few years, I met Dawn. And that's the same with all the other connections, that they led to other connections, and that, doctoral students then go off and they get a post in another institution, and that grows the network. So it's been a fantastic, I guess, yeah, it's created a family, especially in the early days when a lot of people will relate to this in corpus linguistics. You often find yourself the only one or part of a really small minority in a department. And yet when you team up in a network or a research centre, it really makes you feel like you're part of a community.
I've been lucky enough to attend, I think, 3 or 4 of the IVAX conferences in recent years, and I certainly see that it is very much a thriving community. So I'm looking forward to the next conference, whenever and wherever that may be. I'm aware, obviously, that the IVO project is in progress, and I think it's running until 2024 or thereabouts. So clearly, I wouldn't expect you to be in a position to go, here's what we've found, and here's, but are there any kind of initial findings that you are able to share at this stage?
Yeah, well, I guess it's pre-review stage, but we're currently working on back-channeling behavior, and that's just really interesting. What we did was, as I mentioned, we took a function to form approach. So we were able to quantify the amount of head nods that were functioning as back channels in listenership behavior, plus the different forms that were being used in back channeling. And we had already conducted research on Irish English and British English using CanCode and the Limerick Corpus of Irish English. So we had baseline data, and obviously others have looked at it as well. So we were able to see maybe some changes in terms of forms and patterns, but also in terms of the non-verbal behaviour. Dawn's PhD work and developments from that also gave us a baseline in institutional settings. So it's proving really interesting. Dawn will share as well on this, but just some initial observations. Head nods, as I mentioned, are playing a really important role in listenership. And in casual conversation, the most frequent type of listenership behavior is to give continuer, to use continuers. Yeah, and so on. But interestingly, people are holding back on giving continuers. And the most frequent type of back channel in terms of function is the convergence marker. And I think that's because I'm holding the floor right now. You don't need to tell me keep talking, because I'm keeping talking here. So I think people, if anything, don't want to kind of encourage the continuer function. But convergence seems to be important, and maybe that's tying in with positive politeness, but also convergence maybe is expediting the end of a kind of a turn, a transition. If I see you nodding, I'm also maybe conscious that I can wind down what I'm saying right now, which is what I'm doing.
That's really, really interesting. Dawn, did you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, and some of the other patterns we've also seen is particularly in the work I did on the institutional data, so that was supervisory data. There was a kind of general tendency to have co-occurrence of spoken and non-verbal back-channeling forms. So those the ones with the continuum function, so the most minimal, there was a tendency for the use of like yeah with a with a small nod, for example, and that seems to have gone. So we seem to be doing one or the other, but it's quite infrequent, the co-occurrence of these, and that's because obviously when they do tend to co-occur, it might be a bit of a move to take the turn because it pops up, doesn't it? So when Anne was talking about the window, it highlights that you might want to say something. So it's a bit of an imposition. So it's changed that sort of dynamic. And yeah, so there's some interesting patterns that we've started to see. But as Anne says, we've only just really started on the kind of the nuts and bolts of the analysis. But we're hoping to extend it in different ways. So Anne mentioned maybe some stuff about gaze direction, so some stuff about the emblematic use of gestures. So emblems are those sorts of gestures which have very clear sort of meanings. Like a thumbs up, for example. Face-to-face communication, they're quite infrequent. We don't really use them. They tend to be different forms of gestures completely. But in this sort of environment, they have a different role. So we might be examining those. Things about proxemics as well. So your position and your orientation to other people online. These are things that, emblems are quite easy, but looking at gaze direction and so on is very tricky because it's very difficult to know where people are looking and whether they're looking at other people, what their screens look like. So the screen setup for this right now is probably going to be consistent, but when you've got Teams or Zoom, you get to choose how you interact with the system. So that brings up loads of challenges. So as we mentioned at the very start, part of the project is to create sort of guidelines for good practice, but it's also to articulate these challenges, to say, if you embark on these sorts of things, think about these practical and methodological considerations and challenges.
Well, I very much look forward to seeing the research that emerges from the project over the next couple of years. We are going to start to wrap things up now. You may be relieved to hear you've survived the CorpusCast experience, but before I let you both go, I do have my quick questions. In the interest of time, I'm not going to force you both to answer all three questions. My first quick question I'm going to pose to Anne, if I may, and that is, what is or are the biggest changes you've noticed in corpus research throughout your career?
I guess the size of corpora. You just have to, for example, go into Sketch Engine and you'll see 500 different corpora across 90 plus languages, and that's fantastic change. The speed at which we can analyze these corpora and the amount of that we can store as well, and they're all interlinked and very much linked with cloud computing. And then what's wonderful to see is that corpus linguistics as a means to in itself to look at language has grown, but corpus linguistics in terms of being able to look at language in society and language use across professional communications, critical discourse, language learning, etc. And that's just grown so much as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, Dawn, the hot seat switches to you for my second question. What is the biggest misconception of corpus linguistics that you've encountered?
I'm going to mention two. One that I kind of mentioned at the start, that it's all about maths and stats, that you need to have kind of that sort of quant experience. And to be a programmer, actually, they help, but they're not necessarily essential. And the other one is the only route to generate frequencies is through form first. We don't think so. We can function to form is a valid way of doing things, but we need to adapt and develop our approaches to analysis of function in corpora, particularly with corpus pragmatics.
Okay, I will ask this final question to both of you. So I'll stay with you, Dawn, to begin with. In your opinion, how will corpus linguistics make an impact on the world in the future?
Difficult to predict, but I guess they'll continue to be ubiquitous. More people use them and validate methods and critically reflect on language use, I guess. So it's hopefully to enhance or create critical perspectives on how language is used in the public domain, in social media, political discourse, and so on. And
Anne?
Can I just say what she said?
Absolutely.
It's hard to crystal ball it really, and who knows in terms of computing where things are going. But maybe we won't use the term corpus linguistics, but we'll just naturally, as we would Google something, that we can validate and look at language use critically in a much more automatic way through the availability now of tools. And I guess an important point in that is the need for open access, I guess, as well. So yeah, I'm optimistic, really optimistic about the future, because, you know, especially because corpora now are available not just in English, that, you know, across different languages, and that's really exciting.
Well, I'll have to have you both back on CorpusCast in maybe 30 years' time, and we can look and see whether your predictions were accurate or not. We will bring things to a close here. Thank you so much, both Dawn and Anne, for joining us for the episode, and of course, thank you to our listeners and viewers. However you've accessed us, whether that's on YouTube or Spotify or Google Podcasts or Podcast Addict or even Podchaser, why not subscribe and chuck us a good old 5-star review while you're at it? And of course, do let us know your thoughts about this and other episodes using the hashtag CorpusCast. And you can follow our research group on Twitter at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me on Twitter at LoverMob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast written and hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. Thanks again for listening, and thank you to our guests, Dawn Knight and Anne O'Keefe. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robbie.
Thanks, Robbie.